The Nazis are in their final days, and a lone, forgotten bridge crosses the last barrier between the approaching Americans and Germany itself. Americans surge onward, eager to be the first to cross the Rhine, while a few badly outnumbered and outgunned Germans are given an impossible task. This is the story of the Ludendorff Bridge and the chaotic battle which took place between March 7th and March 25th, 1945. While some are honored as heroes, others are unjustly rounded up and executed. Using eyewitness testimonies, we reconstruct the events moment by moment, a battle which was not to have happened, and caught both American and German high commands off guard. Field Marshal Count von Schlieffen, the architect of the dreadful Schlieffen Plan, knew that with the increasing size of the German army, it would be necessary to construct a series of bridges across the Rhine. These would need to be strong enough to handle thousands of troops, trucks, heavy guns, and trains for a new kind of army the world had never seen before. Karl Weiner submitted one such bridge to be built near Bonn and Remagen, and designed for a railroad bridge as early as 1912. This bridge had one principal purpose. On paper, it would connect the Eastern and Western Rhine Railway and Ahr Valley Railways to make transporting goods and supplies easier for the nearby townships. However, the real reason was evident to anyone who was there putting the plans in place. It was built to help speed up the war effort in an upcoming fight with France. By 1916, General Ludendorff, who had been a loyal aide-de-camp to Schlieffen prior to World War I, was the most vocal advocate for the bridge's construction, so much so it would be decided to name the bridge after him. To help build the bridge, Russian prisoners were brought to the Western Front, and they worked day and night, slowly constructing a formidable bridge across the Rhine. The main part of the bridge formed a 1,066-foot-long steel structure, which consisted of the central two-hinged truss arch bridge, flanked on both sides by parallel anchor arms. The arch span was 511 foot long, with arms each measuring 278 feet. The highest point of the arch bridge was 93 feet above the water. The height above the normal water level of the Rhine was 48 feet. In total, the Ludendorff Bridge was a total of 4,640 tons, and would cost Germany approximately 2.1 million marks. It was constructed with military use in mind. Thus, the foundations were heavily fortified with 4 towers. These towers, 2 on the east bank and 2 on the west, were full of loopholes for rifles and machine guns. They were also large enough for armament storage and other requisitions for the bridge detail. An entire battalion could be housed within these fortifications. From these towers, the defenders had a stunning look over the beautiful valley before them, almost making one forget that this bridge was constructed to perpetuate war. Because the Ludendorff Bridge was a natural military target, the engineers were tasked with designing and implementing a way to destroy it in the case of an invasion. The 2 bridge piers were built as hollow shells, complete with demolition chambers. Explosives could be installed at the base of the piers in case it came under attack. Electrical circuits, protected by steel tubing, had been included so engineers could detonate the bridge from the safety of the rail tunnel beneath, the tunnel on the eastern bank. Despite significant measures to construct the bridge on time and on schedule, the Great War ultimately ended, and construction would not be completed until 1919. The French were the first to occupy the bridge, and they discovered how the Germans wanted to destroy it. In response, they filled these detonation chambers with concrete, which, ironically, made the bridge's foundation stronger. It would be easy to forget that the Ludendorff Bridge was built for war if a civilian lived in Bonn and Remagen between 1919 and 1938. Karl Weiner's elegant, symmetrical, yet simplistic design made the Ludendorff Bridge a beautiful sight for anyone living in or visiting the surrounding area. It had 2 railway lines, and people could come to and fro, enjoying the beautiful German scenery and the Rhine itself. Foreigners became easier to transport over the Rhine, and the bridge significantly improved the economies of both the eastern and western towns. Come see the Ludendorff Bridge, a marvel of German engineering and artistry. The two railways were constantly in use carrying passengers to and from, and below the bridge, small yachts brought tourists, locals, and lovers, all in awe of the visual splendor of the area and the engineering marvel which stood above them. But for German generals and strategists, the Ludendorff Bridge always retained its true purpose. By 1938, Nazi Germany was gearing up for a war, and German engineers raced to the Ludendorff Bridge to refix proper explosives in the case of an invasion. On the eastern banks stood a deep, dark tunnel. Here, control switches to detonate the bridge were laid, and the tunnel formed a natural bunker against Allied air raids. However, in 1938, air raids seemed so far away, and even as the Second World War began and the years ticked by, Hermann Goering said, "If a bomb falls on Berlin, you can call me Herr Mayer." Most of Germany's cities had been bombed into oblivion. In the fall of 1944, the German army on the Western Front was in full retreat, as troops and civilians alike sought a way to retreat into the heart of Germany. The Ludendorff Bridge became a paramount in transporting supplies across the Rhine and refugees and wounded soldiers back to apparent safety. This fact was not lost on Allied reconnaissance. American bombers had begun bombing Bonn and Remagen in response to the large numbers of retreating German soldiers in that sector. The Germans were obviously using the Ludendorff Bridge mainly for troop transport, thus its destruction became a necessity. The 9th U.S. Air Force conducted a series of daytime bomb runs on the railroad crossing at Düsseldorf, Cologne, Remagen, and Koblenz. The destruction was predominantly urban, and German engineers were quickly dispatched to the Ludendorff Bridge for repairs. It had taken a series of hits during these air raids. Still, it remained a beacon of hope for any German civilian or wounded soldier seeking safety on the eastern banks. On October 19, 1944, just days after the Mulheim Bridge went up in smoke in Cologne, the Ludendorff Bridge suffered its greatest wound thus far. American bombs created several holes in the bridge, leaving it impassable for 2 weeks. Yet despite the damage and the constant travel going east and west, the Ludendorff Bridge remained standing, almost stubbornly, in defiance of American bombs. Even as Americans approached the bridge in 1945 and the explosives lined for the Ludendorff Bridge's demolition detonated, it remained a testament to human engineering. It was built too well for its own purpose, and it remained, stubbornly, as if a purpose in itself, as one of the last vestiges linking the eastern and western banks of the Rhine River. But come March 7, 1945, the Ludendorff Bridge was not just transporting Germans, but now Americans. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, astonished the Ludendorff Bridge had not collapsed, ordered his hodgepodge of American soldiers forward. He had yet to learn whether the Germans had more explosives ready or not. Thus the time was now, and he and his soldiers began their mad dash up and over the bridge. Machine guns came alive again, the familiar bark of MG-42s in the towers overlooking the bridge. But these men could not stop. If they did, they ran the risk of getting pinned down in the middle of a bridge, probably rigged with further explosives. He could see that the prior detonation had left giant holes scattered across the makeshift patching the Germans had placed earlier. This made crossing even more of a challenge, mixed with the heavy smoke screen the American artillery was laying toward the eastern tunnel entrance. Sure enough, about 2/3 of the explosives Captain Friesenhahn rigged had not detonated. Timmerman ordered half of his men to remove the demolition charges below the bridge, while the other half were to move down the catawalk on the left side. Under the bridge, those moving on the catawalk began to jump from pillar to pillar, the occasional bullet ricocheting off the metal. A platoon of American soldiers had also captured and secured the 2 towers on the western side, and they set up machine guns to give their men further cover. Timmerman decided to help remove the explosives, arguably the most dangerous part of the bridge crossing. There, he found himself with 4 other random soldiers who had scurried across and into the center of the bridge like he had. These men were Lieutenant Hugh Mott, Sergeant Eugene Dorland, and Sergeant John Reynolds. Together, they hurriedly began removing the dozens of explosives lining the underside of the Ludendorff Bridge, cutting the wires and physically removing the explosives by hand. John W. Mitchell, an eyewitness to the event, described Timmerman cutting the wires. Quote, "While we were running across the bridge, and man, it may have been only 250 yards, but it seemed like 250 miles to us, I had spotted this lieutenant, standing out there completely exposed to the machine gun fire that was pretty heavy by this time. He was cutting wires and kicking the German demolition charges off the bridge with his feet. Boy, that took plenty of guts. He was the one who saved the bridge and made the whole thing possible." While this happened, the first American soldier stepped off the bridge and onto the eastern banks. This was Sergeant Alexander Drabik, and he, inadvertently, was the first enemy soldier to step foot across the Rhine since the Napoleonic Wars. He quickly took cover in a ditch as German sniper fire riddled overhead. He said, quote, "We ran down the middle of the bridge, shouting as we went. I didn't stop because I knew if I kept moving, they couldn't hit me. My men were in squad column, and not one of them was hit. We took cover in some bomb craters. Then we just sat and waited for others to come. That's the way it was." Sergeant Joseph D'Alessio was another one of the first Americans to reach the eastern side of the Rhine. His biggest fear was that the Germans would still blow the bridge with many of his men in the middle of it. He had run as fast as he could. He ran into the leading unit, which had slowed considerably from constant sniper and machine gun fire. D'Alessio urged them forward until reaching the left tower on the eastern side of the Rhine. He heard someone shout, "Who has the right tower?" Nobody moved. Many were too afraid to run to the opposite side of the bridge. But D'Alessio felt he had no other choice. He scurried to the right side amidst heavy fire and reached the right tower. From there, he pushed the wooden door in and was greeted by 5 terrified Germans. He described them as huddled around a machine gun. Evidently, it had jammed. A common problem for the MG-42. D'Alessio fires a couple of shots to scare these men and yells, "Untold!" German for hands up. These Germans, who were already wounded, immediately threw their hands up and surrendered. D'Alessio knew the machine gun could still cause a problem, and he was still by himself, so he moved over to it and kicked the MG-42 into the river. Unable to speak German, D'Alessio tried to ask if there were any other Germans upstairs. Either the prisoners did not understand or lied, but they told him no. Not believing them, D'Alessio decided he had to go to the upper levels. However, no other support had come as of yet. He used the German prisoners as a shield, feeling he had no other choice, and slowly crept up the stairs, his gun on the prisoners' backs. Here, D'Alessio found a lieutenant and another enlisted soldier. The lieutenant dove for the tower's corner, but D'Alessio was too quick, and he fired 2 shots and stopped the German. The lieutenant, being no fool, immediately surrendered. By now, reinforcements had come, and they took the prisoners from D'Alessio. He could now get back to advancing. With the 2 towers now in American hands, this meant that the Germans no longer had their strongest element of defense, and the Americans were now only feet from the entrance of the railroad tunnel. D'Alessio and a few of his men ducked into a crater and lobbed several grenades. Despite there being civilians inside, the Americans had no other choice. The German soldiers intermingled with them too much, the chaos too great. They had no clue how many people were in there. The tunnel was dark, and they heard more shouting. But were they civilians or soldiers? D'Alessio didn't want to take any chances and threw a couple more grenades deep into the tunnel. Inside the tunnel, Captains Willy Brodka, Karl Friesenhahn, and Major Hans Scheller tried to assess the situation.
Come on, Friesenhahn. A few men from the sapper units. Counterattack! There can't be many of them. We have to throw them back. Brodka, I've already tried it. We wanted to get out immediately. But look, the tremendous gunfire aimed at the entrance of the tunnel. One grenade after another. You can't subject anybody to that. No one will get out alive. Friesenhahn, there is only one possibility. Escape to the other end of the tunnel, across the dam, a counterattack. The Americans have to retreat.
Both Brodka and Friesenhahn rushed back to Major Scheller, who was close to the other end of the tunnel. They give a scurried report about the Americans forming a bridgehead, and if they are to act, they need to do it now, while there are not too many of them across. However, the forces the Germans have at the present were just not sufficient. They pleaded with Scheller to prepare a counterattack and, more importantly, to get the civilians out of the eastern side of the tunnel. Here, Scheller decided that he had to get reinforcements. Still, there was no car or vehicle, and American artillery fire had grown by the second. He runs to find a radio or a telephone, to no avail. Both had been shot, leaving the Germans no way to communicate with anyone outside of the tunnel. Using the bicycle he had arrived on, Scheller mounted it and prepared to leave to get the necessary reinforcements. Scheller, under heavy fire, began to pedal towards 67th Corps headquarters. However, he failed to inform Brodka and Friesenhahn of what he was doing, which left both men at a loss as to who was in charge or where Scheller had gone. It is unknown why Scheller left without a word, perhaps from sheer inexperience of command, or it was just panic within the heat of the moment. However, this left Brodka at a total loss of words and direction. At the bridge, more and more Americans pooled into the small bridgehead on the eastern side. A panicked Brodka found Friesenhahn inside the tunnel, and he explained that Scheller had disappeared. He was nowhere to be found. Now it was their job to gather all the men inside the tunnel out of Remagen, move east, and prepare to launch their own counterattack. There was no other alternative, especially since most men probably knew that they would be sentenced to death once Hitler learned about their situation. Friesenhahn agreed with Brodka, and both men began to shout over the constant fire from the Americans to the west. They tried to separate the soldiers from the civilians the best they could, and made their way to the eastern entrance of the tunnel. Suddenly, hand grenades landed directly in front of them, and they exploded. People screamed, several soldiers hit. The stench of blood filled the tunnel. Machine gun fire followed, and it quickly dawned on both captains that the Americans had crossed the hilltop and onto the other side of the tunnel. They were trapped inside, and civilians had been caught in the crossfire. Here, the civilians panicked, and a riot inside the tunnel started.
And again the hand grenades roared down from the tunnel. And at a distance of approximately 120 meters in front of us, a machine gun fires right into the tunnel. Suddenly there are screams coming from behind us. We turn around and go back. There are casualties among the civilians. A man, a child. A bullet wound in the stomach, a gunshot in the leg. The civilians are excited. They scream. They cling to the soldiers, grab them and take away their arms. They come to me. Combat commander, order a ceasefire. Stop it. Our women, our children. I too have a wife at home.
Brodka had what could be interpreted as a small mental breakdown, and he grew silent. What could he do? He seemed in a trance, as more American gunfire was coming down the tunnel, and more civilians screamed, German soldiers unable to fire back. Brodka then announces that he will stand down and asks any German if they would take command in his stead. No one volunteered. Many were probably flabbergasted. Their superior appeared to be frozen in place. Even if someone had, civilians forced their hand. They had begun to hoist white flags up on either end of the tunnel. There was no hope for a counterattack anymore. The only choice they had now was to surrender, and Brodka gave the order. They began to wave the white flag, and Americans at the eastern entrance of the tunnel started to shout and radioed in, "Cease fire! Cease fire!" As civilians and soldiers pulled out of the tunnel, the Americans got a good look at how scraggly and disheveled their enemy was. Then, from the darkness inside the tunnel, Brodka and Friesenhahn exited with their hands over their heads, the last to leave the tunnel and surrender. Outside, Friesenhahn looked up at the massive hill overlooking the tunnel and was stunned. He asked, "How did they do it? How did these Yanks get from the bridge to the exit of the tunnel so fast?" He admitted later how in awe he was of the American troops, especially Karl Timmerman. Both Friesenhahn and Timmerman locked eyes for a moment, their respect instant. Friesenhahn, the 50-year-old World War I veteran, and Timmerman, the German emigre to America, and a young officer. Brodka asked Timmerman if he could get some of his belongings from one of the towers. Timmerman, who spoke fluent German, denied his request. "No. Take what you've got in your hand and get going." The peace did not last long, as sniper fire began further down the line. German forces scattered about by Remagen had collected themselves enough to begin properly pestering the American foothold. Most notably, snipers became a problem. which bogged down the American forces a great deal and would hamper any attempts to try and fix the devastated Ludendorff Bridge. Nevertheless, Colonel Engelmann radioed to General Hoge. "Bridge intact. Am pushing bulldozers to the other side. What are your plans? Advise as quickly as possible." Time was of the essence here, as the small foothold was slender at best, and the next few hours would be desperate for them, unless the Americans could get more troops and armor across the bridge. The artillery on the western side of the Rhine began preparations in the event of a night bombardment. Everyone knew that the Germans would likely organize a proper counterattack. Only about 120 men, including Timmerman, had established the bridgehead on the eastern side. As Ken Hetchler, a reporter who witnessed these events, put it, this was a pretty thin force to hold a strategic point like that. General William Hoge overlooked the soldiers charging over the bridge through his binoculars. He could barely make out what was happening through the thick smoke the American artillery was laying on the eastern banks of the Rhine River. That was when he received word from headquarters that Combat Command Company B was to head south, cross the Aue River toward Koblenz, and join up with Patton's Third Army, per Eisenhower's original plan. Allied command had no inkling what was happening here. News had yet traveled to their headquarters, so they were completely blind as to what William Hoge was formulating. This put Hoge in an awkward position, and he could not feasibly see a way to pull out of his current predicament. As said before, Hoge wanted a bridge across the Rhine. Seeing the Ludendorff Bridge was too good of an opportunity to pass up, so he made a decision that could risk his entire career. In his decision to capture the Ludendorff Bridge, General William Hoge directly disobeyed orders. Now, as his troops continue to funnel their way across to capture the bridge, he radios into Allied headquarters and reports the situation. He returns to his command and calls General Hodges directly to report what was happening. General Courtney Hodges was excited over the news, much to Hodges' relief, and the plan began to fall into place. Hodges agreed with General Hoge that they needed to cancel the prior order of operation and begin channeling their forces to Remagen. But to do this, he needed permission from General Omar Bradley, who in turn required consent from General Dwight D. Eisenhower. General Bradley was sitting in his headquarters looking over the reports from the previous day. He had yet to learn that General Hoge had done anything at Remagen, let alone found a bridge, and was in the process of taking it. He then received a call from General Hodges. He became excited over the prospect of the American army capturing a bridge. General Harold Pinky Bull was with him, a man from Eisenhower's staff. Bull, who had heard of the situation at Remagen, needed to be more convinced of its significance. He told Bradley, "You're not going anywhere down there at Remagen. You've got a bridge, but it's in the wrong place. It just doesn't fit in with the plan." Bradley, though, understood the significance of taking the bridge and what this could mean for the future operations on the American front and their planned invasion of Germany. Excitedly, and with a bit of frustration, Bradley replied, "What the hell do you want us to do? Pull back and blow it up?" There were, admittedly, some ulterior motives behind Bradley's enthusiasm. Remember, Bradley favored an American-led, broader front offensive across the Rhine. Securing the bridge at Remagen would allow the Americans to initiate such a plan. It would force the decision to make a broad front offensive necessary for General Eisenhower.
When I received this phone call from Hodges, it was one of the best pieces of news we'd received for some time. It was a great satisfaction that we had been able to capture this bridge, and I expect I was somewhat excited about it. As soon as I finished talking to Hodges, I called Eisenhower. He was very excited about it, and we both realized this is very fine news. It would save us the trouble and expense and casualties of making an assault crossing of the Rhine, and it really was one of the nicest things that happened to us during this period.
Eisenhower shouted with glee at hearing of the Remagen crossing. He gave Bradley and Hodges permission to take the remaining units in Cologne, which had recently been captured, and send them straight to Remagen hastily. He said, quote, "To hell with the planners. Sure, go on, Brad. I'll give you everyone we got to hold that bridgehead. We'll make good use even if the terrain isn't too good." Word then traveled from Eisenhower to Bradley, from Bradley to Hodges, and then from Hodges to Hoge. Cross the bridge and push as far as possible. First Lieutenant Windsor Miller, a tanker and engineer present at Remagen, began to furiously work to fill in Captain Friesenhahn's crater. Everyone seemed shocked that the Ludendorff Bridge remained standing after taking such a beating. It was littered with holes, much of the wooden planks placed by the Germans destroyed. Its foundations had been thoroughly rocked, and most Americans waited with bated breath for the bridge to collapse into the Rhine. But the bridge remained by nightfall, and hundreds of engineers poured onto it with the tools necessary to make proper repairs, even if everything was crude. Miller was called into a meeting with all the officers about their future actions. It was decided that they would attempt to cross the Ludendorff Bridge with their tanks, which were mainly M4 Shermans with 4 new Pershing heavy tanks. None of these men knew whether the badly wounded bridge would have the strength to hold them, but the infantry needed armor support on the other side, and we had to make an effort to get our tanks over there. The Sherman tanks made their way to the bridge and, in a single row, crept their way across it. They were lined up end to end, to which Miller shouted to the tank in front of him, "Don't get too far away." The man in front of him turned back to stare at him. "Sir, I can't very well get too far away with you bumping into me all the time." Eventually, Miller's 9 Sherman tanks crossed the bridge by some miracle. They were the first American tanks across the Rhine. Behind them was an M10 tank destroyer, and they heard a loud crash. It had fallen partially through the bridge. William Hoge described the scene as such. It just stuck there and blocked the bridge, so we had a hell of a fix there, and you couldn't move the damn thing. It couldn't move under its own power. And I told them that cut it loose and let it drop into the river. It didn't make any difference. I had to get rid of it because it was blocking the traffic of the reinforcements and everything. Well, they couldn't do that. So they finally sent a tank back from the far side, and the east side of the Rhine, and hooked a cable to the front end of the tank destroyer and pulled it out. And that opened up the bridge. Then the traffic began to flow. We took the infantry across. The tank destroyer was successfully moved at around 5:30 a.m. on March 8th. With the M10 crashing through the bridge, it was quickly decided to keep the Pershings on the western side of the Rhine, where they would serve as artillery. But this also revealed a more pressing issue. The Ludendorff Bridge was in shambles and needed to be fixed before any heavy equipment could adequately make its way across. Thus, pontoon bridges were necessary, and engineers rushed to Remagen to begin construction, as others ran onto the Ludendorff Bridge to begin repairs. As early as 4 o'clock a.m. on March 8th, American engineers began makeshift repairs on the bridge. Cranes, trucks, and other vehicles moved back and forth on the bridge, carrying the necessary supplies to keep the bridge up and make it usable. The continued German bombardment and airstrikes did not make their lives any easier, either on the pontoon bridge or the Ludendorff Bridge. Around 200 engineers were on the Ludendorff Bridge, working furiously to keep it open so their soldiers on the eastern side of the Rhine would not be cut off. Nevertheless, troops could still cross on foot, and the rest of Combat Command B did so. Several anti-aircraft guns had been wheeled into place come midnight, March 8th, and artillery battalions were placed along the river to prepare for any counter-bombardments. Naturally, the atmosphere was tense. The Germans could strike and stifle what little they had across the Rhine at any moment. The engineers had to work, and work fast, all through the night, using giant heavy searchlights as their primary means of visibility. Disorganized local German forces, the only Germans in the area abundant enough to launch a counteroffensive, began to pick up their attacks. They aimed to blow up the bridge far more than necessarily driving the Americans back. With less than 120 infantry on the eastern side of the Rhine, Miller's tanks became especially vulnerable during the night. Germans with Panzerfausts would approach undetected, then fire up close. Luckily, the Shermans had mounted machine guns on them, providing enough firepower to break off many of these isolated German attacks. Yet no major offensive had started. The ferocity of German resistance began to pick up, and Miller radioed into Colonel Engelmann how desperate their situation was. They needed medical supplies and ammo, and the Germans clearly understood how tentative the American foothold was. Engelmann radioed back, "Hold your place until the last tank is shot out from under you." Major August Kraft and Herbert Strobel were the closest German forces to Remagen as the Americans crossed. They learned of its capture at around 11 o'clock p.m. on March 7th. But what were these men going to do? First, they were not placed in charge of the Ludendorff Bridge. Captain Friesenhahn was. And second, their battalion was spread over a 45-mile front. They only heard of the bridge being captured from word of mouth by local civilians. Major Strobel immediately contacted Kraft and ordered him to supply around 1,000 kilograms of explosives within the hour. He was to then personally make an inspection of the other smaller bridges before the Americans could discover them. Strobel then hung up and quickly gathered whatever forces he could to launch a counterattack. As ordered, Strobel had gathered around 100 Volkssturm and engineers. They launched a brief attack and challenged the 120 Americans across the bridge. They had fought valiantly, some even making it to the Ludendorff Bridge and detonating the explosives, others successfully knocking out several Shermans, which the Americans desperately needed for support. But it was not enough. Strobel ordered the withdrawal after putting up a tremendous fight, succeeding at making 100 men feel like 1,000. Several others were captured, most notably the wounded, Strobel's men in no condition to carry them back. Overall command of Army Group B on the Western Front was Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Hitler's most trusted supporters and battlefield officers. Throughout March 7th and into March 8th, he organized retreats across the Rhine. Specifically, many German troops had been stranded on the western banks. He considered these troops his highest priority, needing them for the defense of Germany. When he learned of Remagen, Model was enraged, immediately placed General Joachim Kreuzfleisch in charge of recapturing and destroying the Ludendorff Bridge. Kreuzfleisch could only divert a small number of men immediately, as most of the troops were already preoccupied with their slow retreat into Germany, but he gathered elements of the 15th Army from the west side of the Rhine. The only others he could find were a few anti-aircraft forces, Hitler Youth, Volkssturm, and local police units, all of which could do little against the Americans. To further complicate their issue, the German command structure had utterly broken down. Who was in charge of what? One of their generals had even been captured as early as March 6th without anyone noticing. General Fritz Bayerlein, who served as General Erwin Rommel's chief of staff in Africa, was placed in charge of the nearby Panzerlehr Division, German armored division. These soldiers did have a reputation for being a formidable fighting force with elite, well-trained, and battle-hardened men under their command. They numbered around 5,000 men, 55 tanks, and 30 artillery pieces, all assigned from other sectors to drive back the American bridgehead. Drama immediately started between Bayerlein and Model. Being Hitler's watchdog, Model pushed Bayerlein to attack immediately, despite his forces being scattered, tired, and undersupplied. Bayerlein made the case that their lack of fuel would make things difficult. It would be best to wait and attack all at once, hard and heavy, instead of piecemeal. Both men knew that with every second that passed, more Americans would funnel across the Ludendorff Bridge, and they would become harder to check. In fact, come daytime on March 8th, the Americans had 8,000 soldiers across the bridge and began to push into Germany. Several German generals had reached out to Major Strobel, who had continued to harangue as many troops as possible to counter the expanding American bridgehead. He was ordered to continue his counterattacks despite his undermanned and outgunned forces, but these orders conflicted. This was the ultimate breakdown in German command. General Richard Wirtz, Model's Army Group B engineer officer, wanted Strobel to use local ferries to float boats down the Rhine and place other explosives on the bridge. Then there was General Kurz von Berg, supposedly the officer in charge of building defenses on the eastern side of the Rhine. Quote, he thought the engineers should be used as infantry to counterattack and wipe out the American bridgehead. To Strobel's credit, he did put up a defiant effort and did succeed at making the Americans' lives hell that first night. It just wasn't enough. Alfred Jodl awoke Hitler at around 8 o'clock a.m. on March 8, 1945, and informed him of the loss of the Ludendorff Bridge. As expected, Hitler grew furious at learning of this defeat, and wanted all those responsible strung up. Joseph Goebbels described the situation in his diary. Quote, "In the evening comes the news that it has still not been possible to eliminate the Remagen bridgehead. On the contrary, the Americans have reinforced it and are trying to extend it. The result is a very unpleasant situation for us. However, we must succeed, for if the Americans continue to hold out on the right bank of the Rhine, they have a base for a further advance, and from the small beginnings of a bridgehead such as we now see, a running sore will develop. As so often before, the poison from which will soon spread to the Reich's vitals." Throughout March 8th and 9th, the Germans had wheeled several medium and heavy artillery units, which constantly bombarded the bridge in hopes of collapsing it, and Hitler intended to increase their firepower. Hitler suddenly saw Remagen as the key to the entire Western Front, and he wanted any and all resources pooled into that sector to stop the Americans from advancing any further. It was March 9th when Model and OKW began to formulate a proper plan to combat the bridgehead, a whole 2 days after the bridge had been captured. They thought there was still time to re-strengthen their weakened forces, who proved again they were stronger on paper than in reality, while also focusing their efforts on Remagen. Trains brought forward railguns, which began to lob shells at the Ludendorff Bridge and the American engineers who desperately began building a separate pontoon bridge across the Rhine. Hermann Goering also personally got involved, committing much of the Luftwaffe, which was a pale comparison to what it was initially. 8 Stukas began to dive bomb the Ludendorff and pontoon bridges. However, the natural surrounding terrain at Remagen made this problematic. The hills on either side of the Rhine meant the Stukas could only come from one direction, to which the Americans were ready with hordes of anti-aircraft guns. Despite a couple of bombs striking the Ludendorff Bridge, it remained standing. V-2 rockets were then diverted and were to be used on the bridge. Many of Hitler's staff were appalled by this decision, knowing that these wonder weapons were highly inaccurate. They would likely kill more German civilians than American soldiers. That is precisely what happened. One V-2 rocket landed as far away as Cologne. However, of the 11 V-2s fired, several landed near the Ludendorff Bridge, creating great panic for the Americans. Other planes began their bombing of the Ludendorff Bridge, such as the Junker Ju-88s and the more famous Me-262s. No expense was spared in the hopes of stopping the Americans and collapsing the Ludendorff Bridge. Despite the thick anti-aircraft fire, the funneled streets on either side of the Rhine made troops and vehicles easy targets. The air raids alone destroyed 256 mortar transports and damaged 35 American tanks and 12 other armored vehicles. German artillery fire on the Ludendorff Bridge had only increased by March 10, 1945. At around noon, a shell struck a gasoline truck, and for the next 2 days, the Americans were forced to send gasoline over the Rhine by barges and ferries, which greatly hampered their ability to advance. Because of the hilly terrain surrounding Remagen, the German artillery spotters had a field day knocking out American targets, such as troop transports, tanks, and soldiers. In total, during the heaviest of the artillery bombardment, the Ludendorff Bridge withstood another 24 direct hits, and still it stood, littered with engineers and troops headed to the eastern banks. The artillery fire had grown so intense that there would be an explosion on a road of the western bank every 30 seconds. One road in particular earned the nickname Dead Man's Corner. Anyone traveling would see a warning sign. This street subject to enemy shell fire. The sign did not exaggerate. It was a perfect choke point for the German artillery to exploit. Trucks would push other trucks to the side of the road in a desperate attempt to get off Dead Man's Corner. Jeeps exploded, bodies disappearing upon impact. It became necessary for medics to remove the dead bodies as quickly as possible to maintain American morale. Still, even though this was put on hold, German firepower was too great. B.C. Henderson described the situation as such, quote, "When the orders were given to go, it meant don't stop for anything or anybody. We could not even assist the wounded. This seemed cold and inhuman, as our buddies were our life. When we reached the ramp, it was more understandable why we could not stop. That ramp became known as Dead Man's Corner for a good reason. As we ran toward the bridge, we stepped and jumped over the dead and wounded. It was obvious why we could not clog the traffic. The engineers on the pontoon bridges would make headway, only for an artillery round to explode before them, killing fellow soldiers and destroying any progress made. They became a target the moment the engineers got to work. Nevertheless, by March 11th at 5:10 a.m., the first pontoon bridge was complete, and heavy equipment could now cross the Rhine. Another was finished at 7 o'clock p.m. further up the river. Over 2,500 vehicles then went over the Rhine to further the American breakout. A decision was then made to close the Ludendorff Bridge completely, so that way proper repairs could be made relatively unabated. Despite several pontoon bridges, the Ludendorff Bridge remained the best chance of getting heavy equipment across the river, both to and from, and at once, while the pontoons remained one-directional. As engineers rushed to the sagging Ludendorff Bridge, they calculated it had fallen between 6 to 10 inches from the constant traffic, failed detonations, bombs, and artillery fire. Yet somehow it remained standing and was responsible for getting the necessary American reinforcements across the Rhine before the Germans could repel them. Walter Model also ordered a halt to any general offensive. He decided it best, having now seen how depleted his forces actually were. The best that Army Group B could do was halt the American advance. With over 25,000 Americans now across the Rhine, numerous German forces needed to help repel Montgomery in the north and Patton in the south were diverted. Any hopes that the German army could regroup to establish a deep defense strategy, as initially proposed, had vanished. This also put a sharp halt on any initiative the Germans might have had, and foiled any chances of pushing back the Americans. Hitler resorted to his tried-and-true loyalty method after his assassination attempt in July 1944. He wanted heads to roll, and immediately sought out those who were responsible. One of the first victims was General von Bothmer, who was in charge of the defenses at Bonn. Hitler blamed Bothmer for losing the Ludendorff Bridge, despite Bothmer having nothing to do with the bridge's defenses. A makeshift court sentenced Bothmer to 5 years in prison and a demotion to private. Bothmer did not satisfy Hitler and shot himself in response to the sentencing. It became clear that Hitler's echelons suspected some semblance of sabotage and cowardice, the paranoia of the July plot still present. Goebbels noted, "It must be assumed that the failure to blow up the Remagen Bridge may well be due to sabotage, or at least serious negligence. The Führer has ordered an inquiry and will impose a death sentence on anyone found guilty." Next, Hitler summoned the loyal and fanatical Nazi general Rudolf Ubner from the Eastern Front. He arrived in Berlin on March 10th, 1945. Ubner would be given a small military tribunal, and Hitler gave the general full authority to arrest, try, and convict anyone responsible for the bridge's loss. German military law stated that all those charged had the right to a tribunal. However, Hitler overstepped those rules and gave Ubner his own execution squad to accompany him. News of Ubner's arrival sent shockwaves through Germany's military leadership, and many began to look for scapegoats instead of owning their own mistakes. Hitler had created the ultimate aura of paranoia, that any German officer could be strung up and hanged by piano wire at any moment. At the same time Ubner arrived in Berlin, Major Scheller had arrived at 67th Corps HQ. Model and Hitzfeld were both present and summoned the major to give a report about what happened at Remagen. Scheller must have understood what was probably coming for him, but complied and described precisely what occurred on March 7th. "But why did you leave the bridge?" Model asked. "I grabbed the bicycle and went to try and get help," Scheller replied. "Why didn't you telephone for help, or at least organize a counterattack?" Scheller knew Model was looking for a scapegoat, but continued, "The telephone was out, and I thought it was important that higher headquarters get news of the situation. Why did it take 3 days for you to get back here from Remagen? Why did you desert your unit? Here Model was justified in his anger. Scheller seemed to utterly disappear once he left the tunnel, and he did not help Major Strobel or Kraft. Scheller replied, "Field Marshal, I was commandeered to hold a roadblock. Then when I tried to get back to my corps, it had moved command posts. I did my best." Model had none of this. Hitzfeld, who had sent Scheller to the Ludendorff Bridge in the first place, watched in silence. Here was a chance for Hitzfeld to stand up for the Major. But he said nothing, and was too afraid of Hitler's noose. Model rose and grabbed Scheller by his shoulder, to which he proclaimed, "Here we have one who is guilty." Scheller had yet to learn about Ubner in his kangaroo court, yet he understood clearly he was already a dead man walking, and his immediate superior, General Hitzfeld, said nothing and left Scheller unarmed and defenseless to Hitler's thugs. Once Ubner arrived at Model's HQ, he was assigned a small staff, to which all of them remained silent as to Ubner's methods. However, all of them knew that what was happening was against German law and immoral. Here, generals were summoned to testify in front of Ubner's court instead of being out on the field in an attempt to retake Remagen. On March 11th, Scheller had been questioned by Ubner's men, but two others were summoned before the court, both Major Strobel and Kraft. Like Scheller, the court proclaimed that Strobel should have organized a counterattack immediately. Strobel protested this accusation, explaining he had done so when he and Kraft learned of the bridge's capture. His numbers were too small, and his men too ill-equipped to properly repel the American foothold. But Ubner had none of this. Major Kraft was confident he would be found innocent, as he followed Strobel's orders without question or hesitation. Before he drove off to his court-martial, he told his staff that he would be back before nightfall. At 4:00 p.m., in a farmhouse, the court-martial commenced. No formal records were kept except for the charges brought against the accused. Captain Brodka was the first to be tried in abstention. He was accused of delaying the Ludendorff Bridge's detonation. He was quickly found guilty and sentenced to death. Luckily for Brodka, he was an American prisoner of war. Model's legal representatives began to protest, one even handing Ubner a copy of the German military code. Ubner waved it aside and said, "The only authority I need is Hitler's." Model's representatives then went quiet. This moment, their only protest. Next, they brought in Major Scheller, to which Ubner remembered, quote, "I am unable to say how long the trial against Scheller lasted, nor could I say how many times Scheller was heard. I admit, however, that I addressed Scheller roughly and angrily during the trial." That day, after little deliberation, Major Scheller and Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters were given their sentences. "We can make this short," Ubner said before reading the sentence. Both men were sentenced to be shot and led out of the farmhouse. Next, Major Kraft and Strobel were summoned. Strobel and Kraft went through much of the same as Scheller during their court-martial hearing on March 12, 1945. Both men fell victim to what was common in the German High Command. What looked good on paper was different from reality. But this did not matter to Hitler or Ubner. To their shock, especially for Kraft, both men were also sentenced to death by firing squad. They were then dragged out of the farmhouse. Captain Friesenhahn was tried next in absentia, in a similar vein to Captain Brodka. Out of all of those brought before the court, Friesenhahn, despite being captured, was the only one found not guilty. It was likely because Friesenhahn had been a loyal party member since 1933. At around 10 p.m., while Kraft and Strobel stood trial, Major Scheller and Lieutenant Peters prepared for their execution. They had been given just 30 minutes to write to their families before being handcuffed and forced outside. It had rained profusely the day before, the ground soaked, and a 10-man firing squad readied themselves. Scheller was forced to turn his back to them, like a coward he knew he wasn't, and he stood tall and defiantly, then was shot in the back of the neck. The letter he wrote to his family never reached them. It was torn up, and his body was looted. The next day, Majors Kraft and Strobel were handcuffed, and in much the same manner as Scheller, were led into the woods. They were also shot in the back of the necks. their bodies thrown in small graves less than 10 inches deep. Their letters, too, were torn up, and their bodies looted. Most engineers marveled that the Ludendorff Bridge remained standing after months of aerial bombardments, artillery fire, heavy traffic, and a failed demolition. Captain Francis Goodwin, an engineer combat supply officer, stood on the bridge on March 17, 1945. His men were hard at work, with the proposed deadline to have the bridge back up and operational approaching fast. Before, he had witnessed 2 V-2 rockets land beside the bridge, powerfully rocking its already weakened foundations. This sent nerves throughout the engineer corps, but they kept working, even as other German artillery fire rained upon them. Goodwin walked the railroad tunnel to investigate some German water supply equipment he had seen on the other end. Halfway through the tunnel, he realized he had forgotten his flashlight. Goodwin doubled back to see if he could borrow one from his fellow engineers on the bridge. His mind worked as an engineer should. He was calculating how much lumber was needed, where men were staking steel, and the steel plates and wooden boards, what equipment would be needed to be wheeled onto the bridge to carry such supplies. He stopped momentarily and spoke with Major Carr, a commander of the 1058th Bridge Construction and Repair Team. They focused on the gap between the bridge where the demolition had failed. It was considerable, and currently the bridge's weakest point structurally. Carr estimated he would have the repair done by the end of the day, on time and on schedule. Goodwin continued to the other side of the Ludendorff Bridge, where some welders were working furiously. He asked them if they had enough gas for the tools, and they assured Goodwin they did. He then watched a crane that was in the process of straightening out a truss. He never got his flashlight, nor returned to the tunnel on the eastern side. At around 3 o'clock p.m., everyone stopped what they were doing as they heard a low rumble from the bridge. Witnesses described sharp, rifle-like fire and cables breaking loose. Then came a loud crack, and an integral rivet had sheared off. There was no time to shout any warnings, and the deck vibrated profusely. Everyone dropped their tools and began running, shouts of panic echoing through the surrounding area, and soldiers popping up to see what was happening. Dust began to rise from under the bridge, and there was no doubt to anyone watching what was happening. After taking such a brutal beating, the Ludendorff Bridge was about to collapse. Engineers suddenly found themselves running uphill instead of in a straight line. Then water rushed around them. Major Carr was washed and sunk down into the Rhine, where he died. Colonel Clayton A. Rust, the commanding officer of one of 2 units assigned to repair the bridge, described the following, quote, "The water of the Rhine swirled around his knees, and in an instant he was engulfed. He had no sensation of falling, but one of the girders soon pinned him under water. How long he was held under, Colonel Rust did not know, but suddenly his trap was sprung, and he rose to the surface just as he felt his lungs would burst. The current then swept him down to the Treadway Bridge, where he was pulled from the Rhine, badly shaken but not seriously hurt." A total of 23 engineers were killed, and another 63 injured. 18 of those killed were never found, and presumed to have drowned and swept up the Rhine River. In its stead, another pontoon bridge was to be built, and members of the 148th Engineer Combat Battalion went to work. To this day, the Ludendorff Bridge has never been rebuilt, and its ruins remain, a sharp reminder of what took place between March 5th and March 22nd, 1945. The battle at Remagen had a profound effect on the American war effort. Especially after the hell that was the Battle of the Bulge, the Battle of Remagen boosted American morale considerably. Between March 22nd and March 24th, 1945, the Allies officially invaded Germany. General Patton swept north from the south, and Field Marshal Montgomery moved in from the north. Strategically, capturing the Ludendorff Bridge had diverted precious resources the Germans did not have, making the overall Allied invasion a much easier affair. General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff, put it best, quote, "The bridgehead provided a serious threat to the heart of Germany, a diversion of incalculable value. It became a springboard for the final offensive to come." The Americans lost over 7,400 casualties between March 7th and March 24th, and 863 men died in the fighting. German losses vary wildly in numbers. However, What is known is that over 11,200 prisoners were captured between March 7th and March 14th. All these men showcased extraordinary bravery in the face of great adversity, proved calm under fire, and were instrumental in shortening the war in Europe by what experts believe to be a month. As for the Germans, the war would end just a few months later. The officers defending Remagen, such as Captain Bradka, Friesenhahn, and Major Scheller, were given an impossible task. Scheller paid the ultimate price because of it. Major Scheller and Lieutenants Kraft and Strobel, while making mistakes, followed their orders and fought the best they could under impossible odds, and were all unjustly murdered because their superior officers were too afraid to stand up for their own mistakes. However, it's here that the author wishes to interject himself and break his own rule. So out of all the changing characters, out of all these people that come and go within the history at the Battle of Remagen, there's always one that is constant from beginning to end, and it's the Ludendorff Bridge. As I kept reading and researching this, because the story has always fascinated me, the tale of how the bridge was captured, how it fell, the battle that ensued around it has always fascinated me, just as the final year of World War II has always fascinated me. I began to find myself looking at the Ludendorff Bridge not as a bridge or as an objective, but as if it was a character within itself. It remained stubbornly standing there. It remained defiant. It remained strong. It was a true testament to human ingenuity. I mean, let's look at why it was built. I mean, it was built for the sole purpose of war, but yet it was completed when the war was over. And so instead of for war, it brought economic prosperity to the surrounding regions. Tourists could come in, people were going under the bridge just to marvel at its beauty, at its simplistic design, only for it then to unfortunately revert back to its original purpose, which was war, come 1938. It was meant to perpetuate the German war effort, but what happened? Instead, the bridge shortened the war. It shortened the war by as much as a month, as some experts have said. And yet at the same time, I also can't help but think that despite being built for war, which war means destruction, it saved hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of lives, both German and American and British and Canadian, Allied lives in general, by shortening the war. And it only fell when it simply could not take any more. And the storyteller in me, the guy who likes his stories, who likes thematic essences and stuff like that, which I don't really like to interject into my histories, but can't really help it here, I found myself caring for it and realized that, yes, this was the reason this entire thing happened, both literally and metaphorically. And because of that, I looked at it as a character within itself, and I still do, and I am extremely sentimental over it. That there's something more here than just a bridge. And it helped shorten the war and saved hundreds of lives.